I stole your necklace at the funeral, Mom. The words hung in the air, sharper than the scent of wilting lilies in the hall. My daughter's face was a blur of tears and shame, and in that instant, the silence in my kitchen was louder than any scream. But what she didn't know is that she hadn't just stolen a piece of gold. She had stolen our safety, and the price was far more than she could ever imagine. Stick with me until the end to understand why. Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I find some comfort in knowing how far my story can reach. My name is Helen Hayes. I am 67 years old, and for the past week, I have been a widow. For 42 of those years, my hands, now thin and spotted with age, knew the delicate art of restoration. I worked with antebellum artifacts here in Savannah, Georgia, coaxing life back into faded portraits and healing the wounds in chipped mahogany. I've always had an eye for the hairline, fractures beneath a perfect veneer, a skill that served me well in my craft, and even better in deciphering the quiet desperations of my own family. The silence in this old townhouse is a physical weight now, a heavy blanket where the sound of my husband Arthur's breathing used to be. The morning air was thick with the sweet, cloying scent of jasmine and the damp earth of a Savannah summer. It's a smell I've always associated with home, with peace. But today, it felt suffocating. My routine. Once. A comforting rhythm of grinding coffee beans for two and listening to Arthur read the paper aloud had collapsed into a series of aimless motions. I'd polished a silver frame that was already gleaming, rearranged books that were perfectly aligned. Grief is a restless, tidying thing. I was standing in my studio at the back of the house, the scent of turpentine a ghost of my former life, when I heard the front door open without a knock. It was my daughter, Claire. She looked like she'd driven straight through the night from Atlanta, her business suit rumpled and dark circles bruising the skin under her eyes. She carried the frantic, brittle energy of the city with her, a stark contrast to the slow, heavy stillness of my home. She didn't hug me. She just stood in the archway of the kitchen, her expensive leather bag clutched in her hands like a shield. I knew that look. It was the same expression she wore as a child when she'd broken my grandmother's porcelain doll and hidden the pieces under her bed. It was a look of guilt, already bracing for the impact of its confession. We stood in the dim kitchen light, the hum of the old refrigerator filling the space between us. I offered her coffee she didn't want and food she wouldn't touch. Then the dam broke. Her composure shattered, and the words tumbled out, raw and choked with a shame that was almost painful to witness. "Mom, I have to tell you, at the funeral, I took your necklace, the cameo one. I was broke and I needed the money." The confession landed like a stone in the quiet pool of my grief, sending ripples of ice through my veins. The betrayal was sharp, a physical blow. That she could commit such a violation in the very shadow of her father's casket was a cruelty I couldn't immediately process. The initial shock felt like a plunge into cold water. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't think about the necklace's monetary value or even its sentimental worth as the first gift Arthur ever gave me on our anniversary. I thought of the weight of it, the intricate carving of the woman in profile, and the tiny, almost invisible clasp at the back. My mind bypassed the hurt and went straight to a cold, primal fear. The pain of her betrayal was a surface wound. The real damage, the mortal wound, was what she had unknowingly done. That cameo wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a lockbox. Its true value wasn't in the gold setting or the antique ivory. It was in what it concealed, a secret so dark. It had dictated the entire course of our lives. Inside the locket's hidden compartment, concealed by a mechanism only Arthur and I knew, was not a picture, but a sigil, a tiny engraved crest, a coiled serpent biting its own tail around a single jagged star. It was the mark of a debt Arthur thought he had escaped decades ago, a blood oath tied to the very fortune that had paid for this house, for Claire's education, for the respectable life we had so carefully constructed here in Savannah. My daughter, sobbing in my kitchen over a few $1,000s she hoped to get from a pawn shop, had no idea she was holding a key to a past that was meant to stay buried forever. A past that, if unearthed, would not just tarnish Arthur's memory, but could very well put her own life in jeopardy. The men Arthur had made his fortune with did not forgive debts, and they did not forget their symbols. They were not businessmen. They were predators who had cloaked themselves in legitimacy, and that sigil was a marker, a claim of ownership. The silence that followed her confession stretched on, thick and suffocating. I couldn't form the words to comfort her, nor the ones to condemn her. All I could feel was the frantic beating of my heart against my ribs. A trapped bird. How could I explain to her that the father she idolized, the man she just mourned as a pillar of integrity, had built their world on a foundation of dangerous lies? Revealing the truth would shatter her image of him completely, poisoning every good memory she had. But keeping silent felt like letting her walk into a minefield. I still hadn't processed that a piece of me was gone, and now I realized she had just lit the fuse on a bomb I'd spent a lifetime trying to dismantle. My studio, my sanctuary, suddenly felt like a museum of our shared deception. Every restored piece of furniture, every polished surface, seemed to reflect the pristine facade we had presented to the world. Arthur was a master at it. He had the easy charm of a Southern gentleman, a warm smile, and a firm handshake that inspired trust. He donated to local charities, sat on historical preservation boards, and was known for his impeccable character. No one in Savannah would ever believe the truth of his origins, the cold, calculating ruthlessness that had clawed him out of poverty and into this life. I was his partner in that creation, the restorer of his public image. I remember the day he gave me the necklace. We were young, newly married, and had just bought this house. His hands trembled slightly as he fastened it around my neck. "Never take this off, Helen," he had whispered, his voice low and serious, a tone I rarely heard. "It's not just a gift. It's our insurance. It's a reminder of where we came from, and a warning to never go back." At the time, I thought it was romantic, a dramatic flourish. I didn't understand it was a literal warning, a symbol of a life he was running from, a life that could still reach out and pull us back in. The distance between Claire and me had been growing for years, a slow, silent drift. Her life in Atlanta was fast-paced, expensive, and stressful. Our phone calls had become perfunctory, filled with talk about the weather and her work, but never the truth. I could hear the strain in her voice, the unspoken plea for help that her pride would never let her voice. I knew she was struggling with money, but I never imagined this level of desperation. I had failed to see the cracks in her life, just as she had failed to see the ones in ours. We were strangers, connected only by a shared history that was, itself, a lie. Now, that lie was in her possession, ticking like a time bomb in her purse. My grief for Arthur was suddenly eclipsed by a terrifying, immediate panic for Claire. The quiet, empty rooms of my house no longer felt like a place of mourning. They felt like a cage. My world, which had already shrunk to the confines of these four walls since Arthur's death, now felt impossibly small. Outside, the world was moving on, but inside, I was trapped with a 40-year-old secret that was about to come due. The challenge wasn't just to get the necklace back. It was to save my daughter from an inheritance she never knew she had. I walked over to the kitchen window and stared out at the Spanish moss dripping from the ancient oak in our garden. It looked like gray, tangled hair, like the webs of secrets we had woven around ourselves for so long. For the first time in my life, I felt truly old. Not just tired or grieving, but fragile and powerless. How was I, a 67-year-old woman who hadn't driven on an interstate in 5 years, supposed to navigate the complexities of Atlanta to find my daughter and intercept a danger I couldn't even name to her? My hands, once steady enough to repaint the pupil in a miniature portrait, were now trembling so badly I had to clench them into fists. My mind raced through the possibilities, each one worse than the last. What if she'd already sold it? Pawn shops, antique dealers. Some were legitimate, but others were fronts. Places where unique items were funneled to discerning and often dangerous private collectors. A piece like that cameo, with its unique craftsmanship and hidden sigil, wouldn't just be melted down for gold. It would be examined. The right person, a person from Arthur's old life, would recognize that serpent mark instantly. It wasn't just a signature, it was a summons. I looked back at Claire, who was now quietly weeping at the kitchen table, her face buried in her hands. Her sobs were of shame and financial desperation. She was crying over a debt I could have easily paid, while I was frozen by the fear of a debt that could only be paid in blood. The irony was a bitter pill in my throat. I had spent my entire marriage protecting this secret to give her a safe, perfect life, and in doing so I had left her completely unprepared for the truth, making her vulnerable in a way I had never anticipated. She didn't know the real reason we never visited Arthur's supposed hometown, or why he had no old friends, only the new ones he'd made here. She didn't know why he insisted on paying for everything in cash for the first decade of our marriage, or why he would sometimes grow quiet and cold when a certain name was mentioned on the news. I had accepted these eccentricities as parts of the man I loved, the price of his mysterious past. Now, I saw them for what they were, the careful, calculated steps of a man trying to outrun his own shadow. And he had taught me to walk in step with him, right into this trap. I tried calling her phone later that evening, after she'd left in a flurry of apologies and promises to make it right. The call went straight to voicemail. Her voice on the recording was bright and professional, the one she used for work, a mask of competence that bore no resemblance to the broken woman who had been in my kitchen. I called again, and again. Each unanswered ring echoed the widening chasm between us, a chasm now filled with a danger she couldn't see. The silence on the other end of the line was no longer just distance. It felt like a countdown. My home, once a sanctuary of carefully curated beauty, now felt menacing. The portraits on the walls seemed to watch me with knowing eyes. The polished wood of the furniture felt cold and hard. Every object Arthur and I had collected was a prop in the play of our lives, and the stage was now set for the final act. I felt a wave of anger at him, hot and sharp, for leaving me alone to handle this. He had died peacefully in his sleep, his secrets intact, leaving me as the sole guardian of a legacy that was about to crumble and crush our only child beneath it. I walked into his study, a room I hadn't been able to bring myself to touch since he passed. The air was stale, thick with the scent of old paper and the faint aroma of the pipe tobacco he used to smoke. On his desk, beside a stack of unopened mail, was his old leather-bound address book. My hand hesitated over it. For 40 years, I had respected his privacy, his unspoken rule that his past was his alone. I had never looked inside. But now, his past was threatening my daughter's future. With a trembling hand, I opened it. The pages were filled with his neat architectural handwriting, names and numbers from his life in Savannah, business associates, friends, doctors, but tucked into a small pocket on the inside. Back cover was a single folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was it. This was his contingency plan, the map to the life he had buried. Unfolding it felt like opening a tomb. On it were not names, but 3 addresses, one in New Orleans, one in Miami, and one in Atlanta. Beside the Atlanta address was a single cryptic name, The Alchemist. That name, The Alchemist, hit me with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't a person. It was a place. A high-end, discreet antique dealer. A place Arthur had mentioned once, years ago, in a hushed, angry phone call I wasn't meant to overhear. He had called it a clearinghouse for ghosts. It was a place where valuable, untraceable items were bought and sold, no questions asked. It was exactly the kind of place a desperate person with a unique piece of jewelry would be directed to by someone in the know. Claire wouldn't go to a common pawn shop. She was too smart, too proud. She would find a specialist. The realization settled in my stomach like a block of ice. She was already on her way there. Or perhaps she was there right now, innocently presenting the cameo to a man who would recognize its sigil as clearly as if it were a flashing red light. He would know who it belonged to. and he would know that its appearance meant one of two things. Either Arthur was dead, or he was in trouble and sending a message. Either way, it would trigger a chain of events I couldn't possibly control. The debt would be called in. I sank into Arthur's worn leather chair, the address book still open in my lap. The weight of my helplessness was crushing. I was a 67-year-old widow in a silent house in Savannah. My daughter was in a city of millions, about to unknowingly signal a group of dangerous men from her father's past. Every instinct screamed at me to go after her, to get on the road and drive, but I was paralyzed by the sheer scale of it. The fight wasn't just with Claire's mistake, it was with a ghost, with a history I had willingly ignored for the sake of a comfortable life. The room grew dark as the sun set, but I didn't turn on a light. I sat there, enveloped in the shadows of my husband's study, surrounded by the artifacts of a life that was a beautiful, elaborate lie. The silence of the house was no longer just about grief, it was the quiet before a storm. I felt utterly and completely trapped, caught between a truth that would destroy my daughter's past and a secret that would certainly destroy her future. I had no clear path forward, only two terrible choices, and I was running out of time. My silent struggle was over. The war was about to begin. For what felt like an eternity, I remained in Arthur's chair, a prisoner in the fortress of his secrets. The name, The Alchemist, was a poison seeping into my thoughts, conjuring images of dark, wood-paneled rooms and men with eyes that saw more than just antiques. My anger at Arthur had cooled into a familiar, weary ache. He had built this beautiful cage for us, gilded with comfort and security, and then simply left, leaving the key to the lock on the outside. I had been his willing accomplice, turning a blind eye to the shadows because the light was so pleasant. Now, the shadows were all that was left, and they were coming for my daughter. The thought of Atlanta was paralyzing. It was a concrete beast, a sprawling, indifferent city I hadn't navigated in years. The idea of driving there, of searching for a place I only knew by a cryptic name, felt as impossible as trying to restore a pile of dust. I was 67. My hands had started to shake. My world had shrunk to the quiet streets of Savannah, to my garden, my studio, my grief. How could I possibly face a danger I couldn't even define? The sheer weight of my own inadequacy pressed down on me, and for a moment, I considered the unthinkable, doing nothing, simply waiting, hoping the bomb Claire had lit would somehow fizzle out. But inaction is its own kind of death. My gaze drifted across Arthur's desk, past the neat stacks of paper and the cold pipe, and landed on a small silver frame. It held a photograph of Claire, taken on her 5th birthday in Forsyth Park. She was wearing a yellow sundress, her face bright with a gap-toothed smile, and her small hand was wrapped tightly around my index finger. I remembered the feel of her tiny fingers, their absolute, unconditional trust. I remembered the fierce, primal wave of protectiveness that had washed over me that day, a silent vow that I would stand between her and any harm the world could conjure. That memory was a flash of lightning in the dark room. It cut through the paralyzing grief and the self-pity. Arthur was gone. His choices were in the past. But Claire was here now, walking toward a cliff she couldn't see, and I was the only one who knew it was there. That little girl in the yellow dress was still my daughter. The vow I made to her in the park that day didn't have an expiration date. It wasn't contingent on my age, or my strength, or my courage. It was absolute. The quiet restorer, the grieving widow, those were roles I had played. My true fundamental identity was the one in that photograph. I was her mother. A strange energy, cold and clear, began to move through my limbs. It was the same focus I felt when faced with a shattered piece of porcelain, the moment when despair gives way to methodical assessment. Panic was a luxury. Fear was a distraction. What I needed was a plan. I pushed myself up from the leather chair, my joints protesting with a groan, and walked out of the study, leaving the shadows behind me. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't need to. I knew the way forward was not in his past, but in my daughter's future. In the dim light of the hallway, I caught my reflection in the ornate gilt mirror. I saw the lines on my face, the silver in my hair, the tired slump of my shoulders. But I also saw something else in my eyes, a flicker of the woman I used to be before my life became about maintaining a perfect surface. I had run a business, negotiated with wealthy and difficult clients, and held my own in a world that often dismissed women of my generation. I had strength I had allowed to go dormant. This problem was no different from a complex restoration. I had to identify the damage, find the right tools, and work carefully to mend what was broken without destroying the whole. The first step was the simplest and the most difficult. I had to go to Atlanta. The name, The Alchemist, and the address from Arthur's book were my only leads. It was a fragile thread, but it was the only one I had. My mind started working, pushing aside the emotional turmoil and focusing on logistics. I would need to leave tonight. The longer I waited, the more time Claire had to complete the sale, to unwittingly hand over the key to our ruin. The thought of her, alone, and vulnerable in that city, was a spur, pushing me past my own hesitation. Of course, the doubt came rushing back in a tidal wave. I stood in the middle of the hall, my resolve wavering. What if I was wrong? What if the alchemist was just an old acquaintance? A dead end? What would I even do if I found the place? March in and demand the necklace back? These men, these ghosts from Arthur's past, weren't the kind of people one reasoned with. A cold knot of fear tightened in my stomach. I was an amateur walking onto a stage with seasoned, ruthless actors. I was bringing a paintbrush to a gunfight. For a fleeting second, I considered calling the police. It was the sensible, rational thing to do. I could report the necklace stolen, but the words died in my throat before I even formed them. What would I say? My daughter stole my necklace, but please, you have to get it back before someone recognizes the secret gangster sigil inside? It would unravel everything. Arthur's carefully constructed reputation would be destroyed. Claire would be questioned, and her desperation would become a public record. This wasn't a matter for the law. This was a family secret, a poison we had brewed ourselves, and we had to be the ones to contain it. The realization settled with a grim finality. I was completely on my own. There was no one to call, no one to ask for help. This burden was mine and mine alone. It was the final price of my 40-year partnership with Arthur, the last debt to be paid. Accepting this didn't make me feel stronger, but it made me feel clearer. The path was terrifying, but it was the only one. To do nothing was to sacrifice Claire on the altar of my own fear, and that was a price I was unwilling to pay. My daughter's life was worth more than my comfort, more than my safety. With newfound purpose, I walked into my bedroom and pulled a small, sturdy suitcase from the top of the closet. The sound of its wheels clicking on the hardwood floor was decisive, a sound of departure. I began to pack with the same methodical precision I used to lay out my restoration tools. I chose practical clothes, comfortable shoes, and my old, reliable raincoat, despite the clear sky outside. I folded a worn road atlas of Georgia and placed it on top. I didn't fully trust the navigation on my phone. I preferred the certainty of paper and ink. I went back to Arthur's study and retrieved the leather address book, tucking the single, yellowed page with the 3 addresses into my handbag. Then I went to his bookshelf and pulled out a thick volume titled A History of Southern Mansions. Inside, a section had been hollowed out. It contained a thick envelope with several $1,000s in cash. Arthur had always called it his disappearing money. "For emergencies you can't explain," he'd said once with a grim smile. The irony was so bitter it almost made me laugh. His escape fund was now financing my mission to clean up the mess he'd escaped from. My hands were steady as I dialed my neighbor, Martha. I kept my voice even, telling her a practiced lie about Claire needing me in Atlanta for a few days. "She's just having a tough time after the funeral. You know how it is," I said, the words feeling like shards of glass in my mouth. Martha offered her condolences and promised to collect the mail. Hanging up the phone, I felt a profound sense of isolation. I was cutting my last tie to my normal life, stepping off the map of the world I knew. Standing at the front door, car keys clutched in my hand, I took one last look at the home I had shared with Arthur for over 40 years. Every object, every shadow, held a memory. It was a house built on love, but its foundation was a lie. It was a beautiful, fragile thing, and I was leaving it behind to keep it from shattering completely. My eyes fell on a portrait of Arthur hanging in the foyer, painted when he was a younger man, his smile confident and charming. His painted eyes seemed to watch me, full of secrets he had taken to his grave. "I will fix this, Arthur," I whispered to the portrait, my voice low and fierce. It wasn't a promise made from love, but from necessity. "I will clean up what you left behind." The words hung in the silent air, a final, definitive break from the passive role I had played for so long. I was no longer just the keeper of his secrets. I was becoming the executor of their consequences. This was my responsibility now. I opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the humid Savannah night. The sweet scent of jasmine, which had felt so suffocating that morning, now seemed to clear my head. It was the smell of home, the place I was fighting to protect. I walked down the stone path to my car, a sturdy, 10-year-old Buick that I rarely drove further than the grocery store. It felt solid and dependable under my hands. The engine turned over with a low, reassuring rumble, a sound of readiness. As I backed out of the driveway, the warm lights of my house receded. In the rearview mirror, looking small and vulnerable, the quiet, tree-lined street, once the entire boundary of my world, now looked like the starting line of a desperate race. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in the pit of my stomach. But it was no longer a paralytic agent. It was fuel. I was driving toward an unknown threat, armed with nothing but a name, an address, and a mother's desperate, unyielding resolve. The point of no return had been crossed with the turning of the ignition key. The interstate out of Savannah was a river of red and white lights, a roaring, impersonal current that swept my old Buick along in its flow. For the first hour, my knuckles were white on the steering wheel, my body rigid with a tension I hadn't felt in decades. Every passing semi-truck felt like a physical assault, its roar shaking the frame of my car and my resolve. This was a world built for the young and the ruthless, a world of speed and instinct I had long since retired from. The quiet, moss-draped streets of my home felt a million miles away, a different lifetime. I was a ghost haunting a machine, propelled forward only by a name and a fear. My first mistake was missing the turnoff for I-16. I was so focused on the sheer terror of navigating the highway at 80 miles per hour that I sailed right past the glowing green sign. The realization came 10 miles later, a cold slap of incompetence. I had to pull off onto a dark, deserted exit and wrestle with the giant, clumsy road atlas under the dim glow of the dome light. My hands trembled as I tried to trace the thin red lines, my own foolishness a bitter taste in my mouth. I felt ancient and useless, a relic from a slower time, and the urge to just turn the car around and flee back to the safety of my silent home was almost overwhelming. The journey was a physical ordeal. A dull ache settled deep in my lower back, and my eyes burned from staring into the relentless stream of headlights. The world outside. My windows was a blur of darkness and fleeting, anonymous lights. I was completely alone, an anonymous traveler in a sea of strangers, and the isolation was profound. This was Arthur's world, I realized. The world of constant movement, of navigating dangers seen and unseen. For 40 years, I had lived in the calm harbor he had built, never truly understanding the turbulent waters he had navigated to create it. Now, I was caught in the storm without a captain. After what felt like a lifetime, I saw the glowing sign of a 24-hour diner, a lonely beacon in the oppressive darkness. I pulled in, the crunch of gravel under my tires a welcome sound of stillness. The place smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, a far cry from the jasmine and wood polish of my home. I ordered a black coffee and a piece of toast I couldn't eat, just to have a reason to sit in the cracked vinyl booth. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, called me Hun, and moved with an efficiency that felt both alien and admirable. This was the real world, unvarnished and weary, and I was a tourist in it. Sitting there, under the harsh fluorescent lights, something inside me shifted. The panic began to recede, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. Crying wouldn't help. Wishing Arthur were here wouldn't change a thing. I was the only piece on the board. I spread the atlas out on the sticky table, the coffee cup leaving a damp ring on the page. I wasn't just looking for a route anymore. I was studying the layout of Atlanta, memorizing the arteries and veins of the city. I was approaching it not as a terrified old woman, but as a restorer examining a complex piece. I had to understand its structure before I could begin my work. This new focus felt foreign, almost like I was channeling a part of Arthur I had always known was there, but had chosen to ignore. His pragmatism, his ability to compartmentalize emotion and focus on a singular objective. I forced myself to drink the bitter coffee, the warmth spreading through my cold hands. I made a list on a napkin. Find a motel near the address, observe the location, formulate a plan of approach. It was a simple, logical progression. For the first time since Claire's confession, I felt a flicker of agency. I wasn't just being swept along by events. I was starting to navigate. The discipline was fragile, easily broken. As I drove into the sprawling, glittering expanse of Atlanta just before dawn, my confidence wavered. The sheer number of cars, the towering buildings that blocked out the stars, the cacophony of a city that never slept. It was an assault on the senses. My quiet, ordered life in Savannah had not prepared me for this. I felt like a sparrow in a hurricane. The old Helen, the one who deferred, who maintained the peace, who retreated to the quiet solitude of her studio, wanted to find the nearest exit and run. The external world seemed to reflect my internal turmoil. A driver laid on his horn, his face a mask of fury, as I hesitated at a complex intersection. The clerk at the cheap motel I found looked me over with a dismissive glance, his boredom a silent judgment of my age and my obvious displacement. These small cuts of incivility were a language I was no longer fluent in. In Savannah, my name, my home, my history afforded me a certain level of respect. Here, I was nobody. A 67-year-old woman with a Savannah license plate, utterly invisible and irrelevant. And that invisibility, I slowly realized, could be a weapon. I spent the first day in Atlanta fighting a war within myself. Every time the fear threatened to swallow me, I would pull out the photograph of 5-year-old Claire from my wallet. I would look at her trusting smile and force myself to breathe. The memory of my promise to her became a mantra, a shield against the voice in my head that whispered of failure. That voice sounded so much like Arthur's, calm, rational, and utterly dismissive of my capabilities in a world like this. "You're a restorer, Helen, not a strategist," it would say. I had to prove that voice wrong. The address from Arthur's note led me to Buckhead, an area of Atlanta defined by sleek high-rises and designer boutiques. The Alchemist was not the dusty, ominous antique shop I had pictured. It was an art gallery, discreet and impossibly chic, with a single, elegant name etched in gold on a black marble facade. There was no sign, no window display, just an imposing set of lacquered black doors. It was a place designed to be inaccessible, to project an aura of exclusivity and power. My heart sank. This was a fortress, and I felt more out of my depth than ever. Instead of retreating, I found a small cafe across the street, took a table by the window, and I watched. For hours, I sat with a cup of tea I barely touched, my old skills of observation kicking in. I wasn't restoring a painting. I was studying a system. I noted the deliveries that arrived in unmarked vans. I watched the clients who came and went, men in tailored suits and women dripping with quiet, expensive jewelry. They never browsed. They arrived, were admitted by a silent doorman, and left a short time later. This was not a gallery. It was a private bank for beautiful, untraceable things. My fear began to morph into a cold, calculated anger. These people, this place, they were all part of the world that had ensnared Arthur, the world that now threatened Claire. They operated under a veneer of sophistication, just as he had. They used beauty and history as a currency for secrets and power. I knew these people. I had spent my entire career catering to their tastes, restoring the very objects they used to signal their status. For the first time, I saw the connection between my world and Arthur's. The line between a legitimate collector and a man like him was thinner than I had ever imagined. By the second day, a plan began to form, born from my own expertise. I couldn't go in as a frantic mother. They would dismiss me in an instant. I had to enter their world on their terms. I would be Helen Hayes, the renowned restorer from Savannah, a name that carried weight in certain circles. I would invent a story. I was searching for a specific, rare piece on behalf of a wealthy, anonymous client. A piece so unique that only a place like The Alchemist would know of its whereabouts. It was a lie, but it was a lie built on the foundation of my truth. The thought was terrifying. It meant walking willingly into the lion's den. It meant performing, acting a part with stakes that were unimaginably high. My hands trembled at the thought, and the old anxieties came flooding back. What if they saw through me? What if my voice shook? What if they already had the necklace and knew exactly who I was? The what-ifs were a paralyzing chorus. I spent that evening in my sterile motel room, pacing the thin carpet, the script of my lie replaying over and over in my mind. But as I rehearsed, something strange happened. The role began to feel less like a performance and more like an exhumation. I was digging up a part of myself I had buried long ago. The sharp, shrewd businesswoman who had built a respected enterprise from nothing. The woman who could look a wealthy Savannah patriarch in the eye and tell him his prized heirloom was a clever fake. The woman who understood that value, power, and perception were an elaborate, intertwined dance. I had forgotten that woman existed. My progress was slow, measured in small victories. I went out and bought a new outfit, not the practical, sensible clothes I had packed, but a tailored silk blouse and a pair of elegant trousers. It was armor. I had my hair professionally styled. These were not acts of vanity. They were strategic preparations for battle. With each deliberate choice, I felt myself shedding the skin of the grieving widow and stepping into the role I needed to play. I was no longer just reacting to Arthur's past. I was actively shaping my family's future. The confidence was not a sudden wave, but a slow, rising tide. It came from the methodical planning, from the realization that my own life's work had inadvertently prepared me for this very moment. I understood the language of antiques, the nuances of provenance, the subtle codes of the wealthy. I knew how to speak about value without ever mentioning a price. Arthur's world of secrets and my world of artifacts were not so different after all. They were both about understanding the hidden story behind a beautiful facade. On the third morning, I stood before the motel room's cheap full-length mirror. The woman looking back at me was a stranger. Her eyes were still tired, but they held a sharp, focused light that hadn't been there a week ago. The lines on her face now looked less like marks of grief and more like maps of resilience. The fear was still present, a low hum beneath the surface, but it was no longer in control. It was a tool, a whetstone, keeping my senses sharp. I realized then that the journey to Atlanta had not just been a physical one. I had traveled decades back into myself, rediscovering a strength I thought had been lost to time and a comfortable marriage. I had left Savannah as a victim of my husband's secrets, a woman defined by her loss. But I was not that person anymore. The transformation was not yet complete, but the foundation had been laid. I was no longer just Arthur's widow or Claire's mother. I was Helen Hayes, and I was on my way to reclaim what was mine. With a deep, steadying breath, I picked up my handbag. Inside, next to Arthur's emergency cash, was a small leather-bound notebook where I had written down the details of the fictional artifact I was searching for. Every detail was plausible, every historical reference correct. It was the most important restoration of my life, not of an object, but of my own power. I was ready. I walked out of the motel and drove back to Buckhead, my movements now deliberate and sure. The city no longer felt like an overwhelming monster. It was just a place, a backdrop for the scene that was about to unfold. I parked my car a block away from the gallery, my heart beating a steady, determined rhythm against my ribs. This was not a desperate plea. It was a calculated intrusion. As I approached the imposing black doors of The Alchemist, I felt a strange sense of calm. The woman who had fled Savannah in a panic would have been terrified. She would have seen this place as an insurmountable obstacle, a symbol of a world she could never penetrate. But I was not her. I had already faced the ghosts of my past, the paralysis of my grief, and the limitations of my own fear. The doorman, a stoic figure in a dark suit, watched me approach with an impassive expression. He was a gatekeeper, designed to intimidate and filter. I met his gaze directly, without flinching, and offered a small, confident smile. I was no longer an outsider looking in. I was a professional, arriving for an appointment she had made with destiny. I stopped before him, the polished marble of the building reflecting a distorted image of a woman I was only just beginning to recognize. The journey had forged me into something new, something harder and sharper. I was no longer just trying to fix a problem my husband had left behind. I was here to finish it. I had transformed, and now I was ready to prove it. "May I help you?" The doorman's voice was as flat and hard as the marble floor. It was a dismissal, not a question. The woman who had arrived in Atlanta 3 days ago would have stammered an apology and retreated. But I was no longer her. I met his gaze, my own eyes steady, and gave him the name of the gallery's owner, a name I had found through a discreet inquiry with an old colleague. "I am Helen Hayes," I said, my voice calm and clear. "Mr. Sterling is expecting me." It was a lie, but it was delivered with the unshakable certainty of truth. He hesitated. For a fraction of a second, a flicker of confusion in his impassive eyes, before stepping aside and opening the heavy black door. The interior of The Alchemist was not a shop. It was a sanctuary of silence. The air was cool and still, smelling faintly of old paper and beeswax. There were no price tags, no cluttered shelves. A handful of exquisite artifacts, a Roman glass vase, a Ming Dynasty scroll, were displayed in pools of soft light, like gods on their altars. A man stood by a large mahogany desk at the far end of the room, his back to me. He was tall and slender, dressed in a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed a part of him. He turned slowly, and I found myself looking at a man whose age was impossible to guess, with eyes like polished river stones, smooth and unreadable. This was Mr. Sterling. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, his voice a quiet, cultured baritone. He did not seem surprised. "My associate informed me you were here. To what do I owe the unexpected pleasure?" He had not been expecting me, but his composure was absolute. He gestured to one of 2 severe-looking leather chairs in front of his desk. I understood this was not an invitation, but a summons. The old me would have been intimidated into meekness. The new me recognized it for what it was, a test of my resolve. I walked across the silent room, the soft click of my shoes the only sound, and sat, not as a supplicant, but as an equal. I began to weave my story, the one I had rehearsed until it felt like a memory. I spoke of my client, a reclusive collector in Charleston, with a passion for 18th century mourning jewelry. I described, with the precise and loving detail of a true restorer, a fictional locket I was tasked to find, its specific filigree, the unique cut of its onyx inlay, its supposed provenance from a French Huguenot family. I used the language of my craft, the words that were my truth, to build the scaffolding of my lie. I was not asking for a favor. I was conducting a professional inquiry, a peer in his rarefied world of beautiful, secret things. Mr. Sterling listened without interruption, his hands steepled before him, his gaze never leaving my face. He was assessing me, looking for the hairline fractures in my performance. The woman who had cried in her kitchen over a stolen necklace was gone, buried under layers of newfound steel. In her place sat a specialist, a woman whose knowledge was her armor and her weapon. I could feel his initial dismissal turning into a grudging curiosity, and then into something that felt almost like respect. He recognized the authenticity in my expertise, even if the object of my search was a fabrication. "A fascinating piece," he said when I had finished, his voice betraying nothing. "The craftsmanship you describe is exceedingly rare." He paused, letting the silence stretch, a tactic I recognized from my own negotiations with difficult clients. "We do, from time to time, acquire items of a similar historical significance." He rose and walked to a polished cabinet against the wall, his movements fluid and deliberate. He unlocked it with a small brass key. My heart, which had been a steady drum against my ribs, began to beat faster. I held my breath, my entire being focused on that single tense moment. He returned not with a locket, but with a velvet-lined tray. And there it was. Nestled on the dark fabric, it looked smaller, more innocent than I remembered. Arthur's cameo. The profile of the woman carved into the ivory seemed to stare up at me, a silent witness to all our secrets. My breath caught in my throat, a sharp, painful intake of air. I had to force my hands to remain still in my lap, to betray none of the violent, chaotic storm of emotion that was raging inside me. Seeing it there, catalogued and commodified, felt like a final, profound violation. "A young woman brought this in yesterday," Sterling said, his tone casual, but his eyes were sharp, watching my reaction. Quite distressed. "She mentioned it. Was a family piece from Savannah." He was laying a trap, baiting me to reveal my connection. The old Helen would have burst into tears, confessed everything, and begged for its return. But my journey had taught me that vulnerability was a currency I could no longer afford to spend. I looked at the necklace, my expression one of polite, professional interest, and then I met his gaze. "It's a lovely piece," I said, my voice even. "But it's not the one I'm looking for. The filigree is Victorian, not Huguenot." I pointed out 2 or 3 other subtle details that confirmed its later period, my restorer's eye giving my lie an unshakable foundation of fact. I saw a flicker of surprise in his eyes. I had subverted his expectation completely. I was not the frantic, emotional woman he had likely anticipated. I then leaned forward slightly, my voice dropping to a more confidential tone. "However," I said, "I recognize the maker's mark on the clasp. It's an Arthur Hayes piece, isn't it?" I had said his name. Arthur's name. In this place. It felt like dropping a stone into a deep, silent well. Mr. Sterling's professional mask did not slip, but I saw a new stillness in him, a sudden sharp attention. He knew the name. Of course, he knew the name. "Arthur was a collector of some renown," he said carefully, the words chosen with surgical precision. He was confirming nothing, but his response told me everything. He knew exactly who Arthur was and what this necklace signified. The game had changed. "He was my husband," I said simply. There was no grief in my voice, only a statement of fact. "He passed away last week." I let the information settle in the quiet room. I watched Mr. Sterling process it. Arthur Hayes was dead. The original owner of the debt was gone. The sigil inside that cameo was now a loose thread, a claim on an estate, a claim on a family left behind. I saw the calculation in his eyes, the cold appraisal of a new opportunity. He was no longer looking at a potential client. He was looking at an asset. It was in that moment that I saw my opening. He believed he had all the power, that I was an ignorant widow who had stumbled into a world she did not understand. He saw me as the victim. He had no idea that I had spent the last 3 days becoming a predator myself. "Arthur was a meticulous man," I continued, my voice now laced with a coldness that surprised even me. "He kept extensive records, a history of every transaction, every partner, every debt." This was my final, desperate gambit, a bluff of epic proportions. I saw the change in his posture. It was almost imperceptible, a slight tightening of the muscles around his jaw. The idea of records, of a paper trail leading back to men who had built their lives on the absence of such things, was a threat he could not ignore. The power dynamic in the room tilted, ever so slightly, in my favor. I was no longer just Arthur's widow. I was the potential executor of his secrets, the keeper of a ledger he could not afford to have opened. "That necklace," I said, my gaze dropping back to the cameo, "is a sentimental trinket. Its true value is negligible. I waved a dismissive hand as if its presence were an annoyance. But its public appearance in a place like this, connected to my husband's name so soon after his death, it could be misinterpreted. It could attract the wrong kind of attention. The kind of attention that leads to questions, to investigations into old accounts. I let the unspoken threat hang in the air between us. Mr. Sterling stared at me for a long moment. The silence in the room so profound I could hear the faint hum of the climate control system. He was reevaluating everything he thought he knew about the grieving widow from Savannah. He was looking at me and seeing, perhaps for the first time, a reflection of the same ruthless pragmatism that had defined Arthur's world. He had expected tears and pleas. I had given him leverage and a veiled threat. I had learned his language. Finally, he slid the velvet tray across the polished surface of the desk toward me. "A misunderstanding, of course," he said, his voice smooth as silk. "Family heirlooms should remain with the family. Consider it a professional courtesy. My condolences on your loss, Mrs. Hayes." He was not giving it back. He was retreating. He was cutting a potential liability loose. I had won. Not by out-muscling him, but by out-thinking him, by using the very tools of his trade, subtlety, leverage, and the power of a well-placed secret. I reached out, my hand perfectly steady, and picked up the cameo. Its familiar weight felt different now. It was not just a piece of jewelry. It was a trophy. It was a tangible symbol of my victory over my own fear. I placed it carefully in my handbag without another word, the snap of the clasp echoing in the silent room like a closing chapter. I stood, gave him a small, polite nod, and walked out of the gallery, my back straight, my head held high. I did not look back. The doorman watched me leave, his face now a mask of pure confusion. Back in my car, the adrenaline gave way to a wave of exhaustion so profound it felt like a physical weight. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, the cool plastic a shock against my skin. I had done it. I had walked into the lion's den and walked out with my prize. The woman who had trembled while reading a road atlas was a distant memory. I looked at my reflection in the chassis rearview mirror and saw the same tired eyes, but they were not the eyes of a victim. They were the eyes of a survivor. My meeting with Claire was not in my home, but on neutral ground, at a quiet coffee shop halfway between Savannah and Atlanta. When she saw me, her face crumpled with shame and relief. She started to apologize, the words tumbling out in a torrent of guilt. I held up a hand, stopping her. I reached into my handbag and placed the cameo on the table between us. Her gasp was a small, wounded sound. She stared at it, her tears falling onto the worn wooden tabletop. "We are not going to talk about how I got this back," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "And we are not going to talk about why you took it. That is in the past, and it will stay there." I did not tell her about Arthur's secrets, about the sigil, about the men from his past. To do so would be to burden her with a fear that I had fought so hard to conquer. It would destroy the memory of the father she loved. My victory was not just in retrieving the necklace. It was in my ability to absorb the poison of the past myself, to stop the curse from being passed down to her. Instead, I talked to her about the future. I told her that the secrets and silences between us had almost destroyed our family, and that they would end today. I slid an envelope across the table, the rest of Arthur's emergency cash. "This is not a gift," I said. "It is an investment in your fresh start. And from now on, you will not hide your struggles from me. We will face them together. That is what a family does." The wall between us, built over years of distance and unspoken truths, finally crumbled. For the first time in a long time, she looked at me not just as her mother, but as her ally. Back in Savannah, my house no longer felt like a cage or a museum of lies. It felt like home again. But it was different, because I was different. I walked into my studio, the familiar scent of turpentine and linseed oil, welcoming me. For so long, I had dedicated my life to restoring the beauty of things that were broken by time. I had painstakingly mended the cracks in wood, filled the chips in porcelain, and brought light back to faded canvases. It was a quiet, meticulous, and reactive art. But the journey to Atlanta had taught me something profound. It taught me that my true purpose was not just to restore what was broken, but to build something new. I had spent a lifetime in the passenger seat of my own life, navigating the world Arthur had created for me. I had allowed my own strength, my own shrewdness to go dormant. The crisis with Claire had not broken me. It had forced me to restore myself. It had forced me to become the creator of my own safety, the author of my own future. I picked up a small, chipped porcelain doll from my workbench, a piece I had been putting off for months. But instead of reaching for my tools to repair it, I simply looked at it. I saw its fragility, its history, its imperfections, and I saw my own. We are all, in our own way, collections of hairline fractures, held together by love, by resilience, and by the quiet, desperate hope that we can be made whole again. My life had been fractured by grief and betrayal, but I had not shattered. The woman I am today would not have been born in the comfort of my quiet life. She was forged in the fear of that midnight drive, in the sterile anonymity of a motel room, and in the cold, silent battle of wits in that gallery. I learned that true strength isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act in spite of it. It's discovering that the person you were always meant to be was there all along, hiding just beneath the surface, waiting for a reason to break through. My story is not just about a stolen necklace. It is about the inheritance we all carry, the secrets, the fears, the unspoken truths of our families. But we are not defined by that inheritance. We have the power to choose what we carry. Forward. I chose to carry the love, not the lies. I chose to build a bridge to my daughter, not a wall around the past. The greatest restoration of my life was not of an object, but of my own spirit. And that is a beauty that will never fade. And so, the silence in my house is different now. It's no longer the heavy quiet of grief, but the peaceful stillness of a sanctuary I reclaimed for myself. That journey taught me that sometimes, the person you need to save is the one you've forgotten you. Could be. We all have a version of the alchemist in our lives, a challenge that seems insurmountable, a fear that tells us we are too old, too weak, or too broken to face it. But the tools we need are often the ones we've had all along, just waiting to be picked up. Have you ever had a moment that forced you to discover a strength you didn't know you had? A moment that changed not just your circumstances, but the very person you thought you were? I'd be honored if you would share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your experiences, your resilience, they are a light for others who might be sitting in the dark, thinking they are alone. If my story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the quiet power that lies within, perhaps you could share it with someone who needs to hear it. Sometimes, a shared story is the first step on a new journey. And if you'd like to accompany me on more of these explorations into the heart of what makes us human, I hope you'll consider subscribing. It's good to know we're not walking this path alone. Thank you for staying with me, for listening. It means more than you know.